They fired him at 9:14 in the morning. By 9:36, the building was dying, and the only man who could save it was walking away with his daughter's hand in his, a former Navy SEAL reduced to a maintenance badge, a CEO who looked through him like he wasn't there. One catastrophic blackout, hundreds of lives hanging in the dark, and a little girl who watched her father get broken, then watched him choose to go back anyway. This is the story of a quiet man pushed too far, and what happens when the wrong people finally realize what they threw away. If this story already has you, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. Every week we bring you stories like this, raw, human, and impossible to forget. Drop a like, and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The alarm on Ethan Walker's phone went off at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to. He didn't fumble for it, didn't groan or roll over. He was already half awake, lying on his back in the dark, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of their apartment, the one shaped vaguely like the state of Texas, which Ava had decided was a map to buried treasure. He'd been meaning to fix it for 3 months. He kept forgetting. Or maybe he kept choosing to forget because every time he looked at it, he heard her laughing about treasure maps, and that was easier than painting over it. He silenced the alarm and sat up. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand in without bumping elbows. The walls needed fresh paint. The carpet near the front door had started pulling up at one corner. None of it bothered him anymore. It was theirs. That counted for something. He pulled on his work clothes in the dark, navy blue maintenance uniform, worn at both knees, and padded down the hall to Ava's room. He pushed the door open just enough to look in. She was curled on her side facing the window, one arm thrown over her stuffed rabbit, hair tangled across the pillow. 8 years old, and she slept like the world owed her nothing. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to, then pulled the door shut. Downstairs, he made 2 sandwiches, peanut butter for her, turkey and mustard for himself, wrapped them in foil, and set hers in the small dinosaur lunchbox she'd picked out herself. He wrote a note on the back of a receipt and left it on top. Morning trouble. Breakfast is in the fridge. Mrs. Garza will be there by 7. Be good, and don't teach the dog any new tricks. He drew a small stick figure with a hard hat, because she liked when he did that. He was out the door by 5:15, walking the 6 blocks to Meridian Tower with his coffee and a travel mug that had lost its lid seal somewhere around February. Meridian Tower stood 42 floors above the financial district, all glass and steel and architectural ego, the kind of building that existed primarily to remind people that money had opinions about skylines. Ethan had worked there for 4 years as a maintenance supervisor. He knew the building the way surgeons know bodies, not the surface, but the bones beneath. The aging HVAC system on floors 31 through 34 that ran 3 degrees hot on humid days, the secondary transformer on sublevel 2 that had a hairline fault in the capacitor housing he'd been submitting repair requests about since January, the elevator shaft on the north side that vibrated at certain frequencies if the counterweight cable tensioned unevenly. He knew all of it because it was his job to know it, and Ethan Walker did not do jobs halfway. His crew, Marcus, a big, quiet man from Baton Rouge who'd worked HVAC systems for 20 years, Danny, 26, and still figuring out how tools worked, and Rosa, who was probably the most technically competent of all of them and had twice covered for Danny's mistakes without saying a word, met him in the basement equipment room at 6 sharp. They went through the day's list. Filtration maintenance on floors 8 through 12, a reported water pressure issue in the executive level bathrooms, routine inspection of the secondary electrical panel in sublevel 1. How's the capacitor situation? Marcus asked, meaning the transformer. Same, Ethan said. Still pending approval. Marcus made a sound in his throat that said everything he chose not to say out loud. By 8:30, they'd worked through most of the morning's list. Ethan had been on his feet since before 5, had crawled through 2 access corridors and spent 40 minutes in a mechanical chase on the 14th floor, tracing a pressure anomaly that turned out to be a partially obstructed return duct. He was sweaty, his knees ached from the concrete, and he smelled like insulation foam and old ductwork. None of that was unusual. That was Tuesday. The issue came up just before 9. Rosa found him on sublevel 1 and told him the electrical panel had thrown 2 fault codes overnight. Minor ones, probably, but the kind that needed eyes before the board cleared itself and everyone stopped worrying. It was in the utility corridor that ran beneath the executive floor elevator bank. Ethan went down with her, pulled the panel cover, and spent 22 minutes tracing the fault path. He was right. Minor. Degraded contact on a relay switch, easy enough fix, documented and flagged for the parts order. He was climbing out of the service stairwell on the executive level when the door swung the wrong way. He hadn't been paying attention to which door he'd taken. 42 floors of Meridian Tower, and Ethan Walker could navigate its mechanical skeleton blind. But the service exits up here were not always clearly labeled, and the one he'd come through opened not into the maintenance corridor, but into the back hallway of the executive lounge. He realized it immediately. The executive lounge on the 40th floor was a different country. Marble floors. Recessed lighting designed by someone paid too much to design recessed lighting. A coffee service that cost more per month than Ethan's rent. It was 9:02 a.m. Bar, and the room was occupied. 3 men in dark suits sitting at a corner table, tablets and printed documents spread between them, voices low and careful, the way people talk when they're discussing things worth protecting. Potential investors, Ethan guessed, or maybe the legal team for the Hargrove merger. He'd heard enough background noise over the past few months to know the company was in the middle of something significant. He did not belong here. He knew that instantly. He started to back toward the door he'd come through. "Excuse me." The voice was sharp and came from his left. He turned. Claire Ashford was 34 years old and had run Meridian Corporation for 2 of them, inheriting it from a father who'd built it and a board that had never fully accepted her as its leader. She was dressed in charcoal gray, her dark hair pulled back, a coffee cup in one hand, and the particular expression on her face of someone who had been interrupted one time too many this morning. She was looking at him the way people look at things that don't belong where they're standing. "This floor is restricted," she said. "I'm aware," Ethan said. "I came through the wrong service exit. I'm heading back down now." "The wrong exit." She said it the way a teacher repeats a student's excuse back to them. "There's a mislabeled door at the south stairwell junction. I'll flag it." One of the suited men at the table had looked up. The other 2 were watching from the corners of their eyes, maintaining the polite fiction that they weren't. Claire set her coffee cup down on the counter beside her. "What's your name?" "Walker, Ethan Walker. Maintenance supervisor, sub-level through 14. "You're not supposed to be up here." "No," he said. "I'm not. And I'm leaving." "You reek," she said. It landed the way it was meant to. Flat, factual, with just enough volume to make sure the men at the table heard it. Ethan stood very still. He was good at standing still. "We had a fault code in the panel below your elevator bank," he said. "I was working it out when the door—" "I don't want an explanation," Claire said. "I want to know how someone in your position walks into an executive client meeting smelling like a utility corridor and thinks that's acceptable. I came through the wrong door. It wasn't a choice. Everything is a choice." She turned to the 2 men behind her, near the windows, who he now noticed were standing, her personal assistants or security, he couldn't tell. "Can someone explain to me how this keeps happening? Last month it was the freight elevator. Now this." Ethan had not been in this building last month. He didn't say that. One of the assistants, a woman in her late 20s who would not meet Ethan's eyes, said, "I'll review the access protocols." "Please do." Claire looked back at Ethan. "Your badge." He blinked. "My badge." "Your employee badge. Hand it over." "Ms. Ashford, you violated restricted access. That's policy. Badge, please." Something moved in the room. Not physical. The 3 suited investors had gone very carefully neutral in the way of people watching something they don't want to be responsible for witnessing. The assistant with the tablet was looking at the ceiling. One of the men by the window had the expression of a person who wishes they could leave. Ethan reached for his badge. His hand was steady. That was the one thing he could say about himself. 11 years in the Navy, 2 combat deployments, 4 years of doing work that mattered with no one watching. His hands did not shake when he needed them to be steady. He unclipped the badge from his chest and held it out. Claire took it. "You'll receive the standard severance documentation through HR," she said. She turned away before he'd said another word. Bucket. He found Ava in the lobby. This was the part that cut him at an angle he hadn't been prepared for. He'd called Mrs. Garza from the service elevator on his way down, asked her to bring Ava to the building because he'd thought what? That he'd walk out, collect her, maybe grab lunch somewhere and figure out the afternoon. He hadn't known she'd be standing inside the main lobby when he came through. She was sitting on a bench near the security desk, her dinosaur backpack on her knees, her rabbit tucked under one arm, watching the revolving door. When she saw him come through from the interior corridor, she stood up and waved, big, cheerful, automatic, and then something in his face stopped her. "Dad? Hey, trouble?" He crossed the lobby, crouched down in front of her, looked at her face. Her eyes were wide and careful. 8-year-olds read the room better than most adults. "Change of plans today." "What happened?" "I'm done for the day." "But it's morning." "Yeah." He stood and took her hand. "I know." She didn't ask again in the lobby. She waited until they were outside through the revolving door and out onto the sidewalk in the 9 o'clock sun before she said, "Did you get in trouble?" He thought about how to answer that. Something like that. "What kind of trouble?" "The job is over, Ava." She stopped walking. He kept hold of her hand, which meant she tugged him back a half step. He turned. "They fired you," she said. She was looking up at him with that expression she'd been doing since she was 4. Eyes too serious for her age, jaw set, working something out. "Yeah." "Why?" He thought about that for a second. "Because I walked into the wrong room and the wrong person was in it." "That's not fair." "No," he said. "It's not." She was quiet for a moment, then, "What are we going to do?" "We're going to walk home," he said, "and figure out the rest." She took his hand again, and they walked. She didn't say anything else for a while, and neither did he. The city moved around them. Delivery trucks and dog walkers, and the particular sound of a Tuesday morning that has no idea anything has happened. He held her hand and walked, and tried to think past the dull roar of anger sitting behind his sternum, the kind that didn't have anywhere to go. He wasn't angry about the job exactly. He'd had worse things taken from him. He was angry about the way it had been done. The badge pulled off his chest in front of 3 investors like he was something to be demonstrated. The word "reek" chosen and deployed with the precision of someone who wanted it to land hard. He was angry that she hadn't looked at him when she turned away. He was angry that Ava had been in the lobby. He was pretty sure Ava hadn't seen it, but he wasn't certain. They were 3 blocks out when his phone buzzed. Marcus. He almost didn't answer. "Yeah." "Brother." Marcus's voice was different, lower than usual. "Where are you?" 3 blocks east. Why?" "You need to turn around." Ethan stopped walking. He glanced down at Ava, who was looking at a pigeon investigating a pretzel on the sidewalk. "What happened?" "The building went dark." Marcus's voice was very controlled now, the way you get controlled when things are bad and panic isn't useful. 10 minutes ago, full blackout. Full, Ethan. Primary, secondary, backup. The whole grid dropped and nothing is coming back up. Ethan turned and looked back at the tower. 42 floors of glass catching the morning sun. From here it looked exactly the same as it always did. "How many people inside?" "I don't know. 800, 900? Board meeting's been going since 7:30. Executive floor was full of visitors. Elevators are stopped mid-shaft. The emergency systems should have kicked in, and they didn't, which means the secondary transformer." Ethan was already doing the math. The fault codes from this morning, the hairline fissure in the capacitor housing. If the primary grid had dropped and the secondary had failed to isolate correctly, the backup would have surged, overloaded, and tripped the whole building off. Every elevator, every ventilation system, the fire suppression network running on separate emergency battery, but only for 4 hours. The people in the stopped elevators. If the cars were between floors, the manual release required physical access from the shaft. "Nobody else knows that building like you do," Marcus said. Danny's trying to reach the facilities manager, but the facilities manager is on the 40th floor in a stopped elevator. Ethan looked at Ava. She was looking back at him now, the pigeon forgotten, reading his face the way she always did. "I'll call you back in 30 seconds, he told Marcus, and hung up. He crouched down in front of her again, right there on the sidewalk with people moving around them. She waited. She was good at waiting. "There are people trapped in that building," he said. "A lot of people. The power went out and nobody can get them out without someone who knows how the systems work." Ava looked at him for a long moment. "You know how the systems work." "Yeah." "They fired you." "Yeah." She thought about it. "But the people didn't fire you." He looked at her. 8 years old, standing on a sidewalk holding a stuffed rabbit, being more clear-eyed about it than he was. "No," he said. "They didn't. So you have to go back." He didn't answer that. He'd already decided before he asked her. He knew that. But there was something he needed from her. Not permission, just the look on her face that told him she understood why, that she wasn't going to be frightened by it or carry it wrong. She wasn't frightened. She just nodded, the way she nodded when she'd made up her mind about something. "Can I come?" she asked. "You'll wait at the security post outside with Marcus." "Okay." She pulled the rabbit tighter under her arm. "Don't get electrocuted." "Working on it," he said, and stood, and pulled out his phone to call Marcus back. He turned and started walking toward Meridian Tower. His daughter walked beside him, 3 paces to every 2 of his, her hand in his, heading back toward the building that had stripped his badge 9 minutes ago and thrown him out into the morning like a used work order. 9 minutes. That's how long it had taken the whole thing to fall apart without him. He didn't think about Claire Ashford. He didn't think about the badge, or the investors, or the word reek delivered across a marble floor. He thought about the secondary transformer on sublevel 2, the capacitor housing, the access corridor. He thought about the panel sequence and the bypass procedure and the particular sound that power makes when it's trying to find somewhere to go. He thought about 900 people sitting in the dark, in stopped elevators, in offices without ventilation, wondering what was happening. That was enough. That had always been enough. Marcus was waiting at the southeast corner of the building, near the maintenance entrance, when Ethan came back around the block. He was a big man made bigger by worry. Shoulders up, jaw tight, phone in one hand and a flashlight in the other, even though the sun was still bright and useless for what was happening inside. When he saw Ethan, something in his face loosened, then tightened again in a different way. "You came back," Marcus said. "Don't make it a thing." Ethan looked at the building entrance. 2 security guards were standing at the revolving doors, waving people back, radios going. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, office workers who'd made it out before the elevators stopped. A few delivery people. 2 women in business attire who looked like they'd been mid-meeting and were now standing in the morning air without their phones or their bags or their context. What do we know? Building management is locked out of the monitoring system. The remote override panel on the main security desk, dead. Whatever happened to the primary grid, it took the supervisory controls with it. Marcus glanced down at Ava, who had arrived at Ethan's side and was studying the crowd with the focused attention of a child assembling information. "Hey, Ava Bug." "Hi, Marcus." She didn't look away from the building. "How many people are stuck in the elevators?" "We think 4 cars stopped. Maybe 16 to 20 people total, depending on load." "That's a lot of people." "Yeah, it is." Ethan was already thinking past the elevators. The cars were the immediate visual problem, the thing people fixated on. But the deeper issue was the transformer. If the capacitor housing had blown the way he suspected, it hadn't just dropped the building's power. It had done so in a way that would prevent normal restoration. The building's automated systems would keep trying to reboot, keep pulling current they couldn't sustain, and keep failing. You couldn't fix it from a panel board. You had to go in manually, physically isolate the damaged circuit, and reroute the load sequencing by hand before the automation would accept a restart. He'd known this was coming for 9 months. He had the repair request to prove it. He pushed that thought down and away. Not useful right now. "The access hatch to sublevel 2 mechanical," he said to Marcus. "Is it still keyed to my code?" Marcus looked at him. They revoked your badge, man, not your code. Those are two different systems and nobody's talked to IT yet. Then we have a window. He turned to Ava. You're staying here with Marcus. She looked at him with the flat seriousness of someone who had already anticipated this instruction and accepted it. I know. If anything changes, if any emergency personnel show up and they need you to move back, you go with them. You don't wait for me. Dad? Ava. I heard you the first time. She sat down on the low concrete planter behind them, set her rabbit on her knees, and folded her hands on top of it. The posture of someone who had made peace with waiting. He looked at her for a second longer than he should have, then looked away. Let's go, he said to Marcus. They went in through the maintenance entrance on the building's north face, a plain steel door that opened to a stairwell smelling of concrete and old pipe insulation. Marcus had a battery lantern clipped to his belt. Ethan had his phone light and the knowledge of exactly where he was going. They didn't talk on the way down. Both of them had worked enough emergency situations to know that conversation on the move was mostly noise. Sublevel 2 was the building's mechanical core, a long, low-ceilinged space divided by rows of conduit, ductwork, and the kind of infrastructure that keeps a 42-story building alive and that almost no one above ground ever thinks about. The secondary transformer occupied the northeast corner behind a chain-link enclosure, a gray metal cabinet roughly the size of a refrigerator laid on its side, covered in warning labels and humming with the residual charge of something that had recently failed badly. The air near it smelled like burned insulation, sharp and chemical, the smell of a decision the building had made in self-protection. Ethan stood in front of it for a moment with the flashlight playing over the cabinet face. The diagnostic lights that should have been green were not on at all. The capacitor housing on the lower third of the unit had a visible discoloration around one seam, a brown stain spreading out from a point of failure that he had been writing service requests about since the previous November. There it is, Marcus said behind him, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who knew he'd been right about something and was too tired to feel any satisfaction. There it is, Ethan agreed. The work was not elegant. That was the thing about real emergency electrical work. It bore no resemblance to the way movies presented it, no dramatic moments of choosing the right wire. What it actually involved was pulling the physical isolation switches in the correct sequence to prevent the secondary system from continuing to bleed current into a damaged circuit, manually discharging the residual load in the capacitor bank through a resistive bypass that Ethan had to fabricate from materials in the maintenance supply cabinet across the room, then stabilizing the input feed to the backup system so that when he resequenced the main breaker array, it would have somewhere clean to send power. Marcus handed him tools, called out readings from the auxiliary meter panel when Ethan asked for them, held the light where it needed to be without being told. They'd worked together long enough that the communication was mostly practical, numbers, confirmations, the occasional short warning, and Ethan was glad for it. He was running on muscle memory and the specific focused calm that used to come on him in different circumstances, in different countries, when the situation was too serious for anything but clarity. His hands were not shaking. He noted that distantly and moved on. There was one moment, about 40 minutes in, when he had the bypass assembly connected and was preparing to re-engage the input feed, when he became aware that what he was doing carried a genuine consequence if he got it wrong. Not an abstraction, a real one, with current and metal and a mechanical room full of conductive surfaces. He took a breath, checked his work one more time, the connections, the sequence, the ground path, and engaged the feed. The transformer hummed, a different hum than before, steadier and in the right register. The diagnostic panel lit green. Above them, through the concrete ceiling, they heard it, a deep, building-wide sound, like an intake of breath, as the power grid reinitialized. The ventilation started. The emergency lighting in the sublevel clicked to normal. Somewhere in the building, 16 people in stopped elevator cars felt their cars begin to move again. Marcus let out a breath. Walker. Give it 30 seconds. Ethan watched the panel. Let it stabilize. They gave it 30 seconds. Everything held. Okay, Ethan said, and put down the insulated pliers he'd been holding, and became aware for the first time in an hour that his shoulders were aching and his knees were bad from the concrete floor, and he was still in the clothes he'd come to work in that morning, the same uniform that had been deemed offensive to an executive lounge. "You good?" Marcus said. "Yeah." He stood up slowly. "Let's get out of here." They were back at the north maintenance entrance, climbing the stairwell toward ground level, when Ethan heard the footsteps above him. Not one set, several, coming down fast. He pressed against the wall instinctively. Marcus did the same, a half step behind. The door above them opened and two men came through, building security by the look of the uniforms, followed by a woman Ethan recognized as Janet Reyes, Meridian's facilities director, who he knew by face but had never spoken to directly. She was carrying a radio and moving like someone who had been having the worst morning of her professional life and was not finished with it yet. She stopped when she saw Ethan. "Walker," she said. Not a question. A statement of something she was working to process. "The transformer's stabilized," he said. "Capacitor housing on the secondary unit, the one from the service requests going back to November. The bypass is temporary. You need the parts order filled before you run full load on that circuit." Janet stared at him. "You fixed it. It'll hold for now." He started past her on the stairs. "Walker." She turned. "You were terminated this morning." "I know." "You still came back and—" She stopped. Started again. "The people in the elevators, are they—" "Cars should be moving. You'll want to have someone verify each one physically. Make sure the mechanical releases weren't manually triggered during the outage. If they were, the cars need to be checked before normal operation." He kept walking. Behind him, she said, "Claire Ashford wants to see you." He didn't stop. "I'm sure she does." He came out of the stairwell exit into the lobby and walked through it and out through the revolving door into the morning, which was now closer to 11 than to 9, and found Ava exactly where he'd left her, sitting on the concrete planter with her rabbit and her composure, watching the building entrance with the patience of someone who had decided not to be worried and was mostly succeeding. She looked at him when he came out, looked at him properly, the way she always did when he came back from something, scanning his face first, then his hands, then back to his face. "You smell worse," she said. "I know. But the lights are on." He looked up at the building. The lobby lights were clearly on now, visible through the glass. A ripple had gone through the small crowd still gathered on the sidewalk. Phones coming out, the particular loosening of a group of people who'd been holding their breath and can now let it go. He could hear from somewhere above and to the east the sound of elevator doors opening. "Yeah," he said. "The lights are on." Ava nodded. "Can we get lunch?" "Yeah," he said. "We can get lunch." She slid off the planter and took his hand, and they started walking. He didn't look back at the building. He had no particular desire to look back at it. They made it about a block and a half before his phone rang. Unknown number. Building exchange. He almost sent it to voicemail. He answered it because Ava was watching him from the corner of her eye, and he didn't want to be the kind of person who screened calls in front of her and pretended not to. "Walker," he said. A pause. Then, "This is Claire Ashford." He kept walking. "I know. I need you to come back to the building. I don't work there anymore. You made that pretty clear." Another pause. Longer this time. He could hear in the quality of the silence that she was not accustomed to people not doing what she said. "Mr. Walker, you just restored power to a 42-story building with 900 people in it. Whatever happened this morning, I think we can—" "What you did this morning happened in front of my daughter," he said. He said it quietly, without heat, which was the only way he knew to say things he meant completely. "She was in the lobby." Silence. "I didn't know that," Claire said. "No," he said. "You didn't." He walked another half block, Ava's hand in his, before she spoke again. "I'm asking you to come back to the building," she said. "Not to beg. I don't do that, and I suspect you'd find it uncomfortable anyway. But my investors are shaken. My board has questions I can't answer without someone who understands what happened today. And I—" He heard something shift in her voice, something she pushed through rather than around. "I made a mistake this morning, more than one, and I'd like the chance to address that." Ethan stopped walking. Ava looked up at him. He made a face at her that meant, give me a minute, and she made a face back that meant I heard all of that. If I come back, he said into the phone, I'm not maintenance. I'm not going to stand in your lobby with a mop and pretend this morning didn't happen. That's not what I'm asking. Then what are you asking? A breath. I don't entirely know yet. I'm asking you to come back so we can figure that out. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, 11 in the morning, city sounds around him, his daughter watching him with her rabbit under her arm, and an expression of absolute readiness for whatever he decided. I'll come back, he said. Not today. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, Claire said, like she was accepting the terms of something she didn't fully control. And I want the transformer repair order signed by end of business today. A beat. Done. He hung up and looked at Ava. She looked at him. So we're not getting lunch, she said. We're getting lunch, he said. I said tomorrow. She considered this. Okay, but I want the place with the grilled cheese. Yeah, he said, and started walking again. The place with the grilled cheese? What? He went back the next morning at 8, which was earlier than she'd probably expected and later than he usually started. He wore his own clothes, dark jeans, a plain gray shirt, because the uniform was in a bag in his closet, and he was not putting it back on until he understood what he was putting it on for. Janet Reyes met him at the security desk and handed him a visitor badge, which he noted was a different shape than his employee badge and felt different in his hand. She walked him to the elevator in the kind of careful silence that meant she had opinions she was choosing not to voice. He appreciated that about her. Claire's office was on the 38th floor, not the executive lounge, a working office, large but not ostentatious, with a wall of windows facing northeast and a desk that had actual stacks of actual paper on it, which he hadn't expected. She was standing when he came in, not sitting, which also told him something. 2 other people were in the room. A man in his 50s who introduced himself as Philip Strand, Meridian's general counsel, and a woman Ethan didn't recognize who didn't introduce herself and sat in the corner with a notepad. Claire looked at him. He looked at her. In the context of her actual office, in daylight, she looked not smaller exactly, but more specific. Less like a category of person, and more like a particular one who was tired and carrying something heavy, and was not very good at showing either. Thank you for coming back, she said. You said you wanted to address yesterday morning, he said. I'm here. She nodded once, the nod of someone who has prepared what they're going to say, and is now deciding whether to say it the prepared way or another way. She went with another way. What I said to you in the executive lounge was wrong, she said. The way I handled it was wrong. The badge... She stopped. That was humiliating, and I did it in front of people, and you didn't deserve it. Any of it. It was not an elaborate apology. He appreciated that too. Elaborate apologies were usually about the person doing the apologizing. Okay, he said. She blinked. Whatever she'd been braced for, that apparently wasn't it. Okay. I'm not going to argue with you about it or tell you it's fine. It's not fine. But you've said what you said, and I can hear it. He sat down, without being invited to, in the chair across from her desk. Tell me what you want. Philip Strand cleared his throat. Ms. Ashford has discussed creating a new position within Meridian. I'm asking her, Ethan said. Philip closed his mouth. Claire looked at Ethan with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not offense, not quite. Something more like recalibration. We almost lost the Hargrove merger yesterday, she said. 3 of their senior partners were in the building when the power went out. 2 of them were in a stopped elevator for 40 minutes. She moved around the desk and sat down, elbows on the surface, hands loosely folded. What held it together was the fact that power came back and everyone walked out safe. The story became about the recovery, not the crisis. Because of what you did. She looked at him directly. I need someone who does that, who sees problems before they become crises. Not just in the mechanical systems, in everything. Security, personnel, operational risk. You spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL and 4 years learning this company from the inside out. That combination doesn't exist anywhere in my current leadership structure. You want me as an advisor. personal security, and strategic risk. You'd report directly to me. You'd have access to everything: security systems, personnel records, financial operations, building infrastructure. I need eyes I can trust. He sat with that for a moment. The woman in the corner was taking notes. Philip Strand was studying his own hands. "Why do you trust me?" Ethan said. "You fired me yesterday morning." Claire held his gaze. "Because you came back anyway." He looked out the window at the northeast view. The city spreading out in the morning light, other towers, water in the distance, the particular blunt geometry of a city that doesn't care who you are. He thought about the transformer in Sublevel 2, the 9 months of service requests, the fault codes he'd called out, and the decisions that had overridden him. He thought about 900 people in a dark building and the 47 minutes it had taken him to fix the thing that shouldn't have been broken in the first place. He thought about Ava on the concrete planter, waiting. "I want the maintenance team reassigned to me," he said. "Marcus, Danny, Rosa, they stay." "Done." "I want operational authority over building security and infrastructure, not advisory authority. If I flag something, it gets acted on." Claire didn't look at Philip. "Done. And I want a chair at the table in the Hargrove meetings, not as staff, as someone with standing to speak." This one she sat with for a second. Then, "Done." He nodded. "Then I'll take the position." What he didn't say, sitting in her office on the 38th floor with the city spread out behind her, and the particular quality of morning light making everything look more resolved than it was that he'd already felt it on the walk back through the building. That thing he'd felt in the mechanical tunnels the previous day, tracing the fault path in the dark, the focus, the competence, the sense of a problem that had a solution if you were patient enough and careful enough to find it. He'd been chasing some version of that for 4 years, in the maintenance corridors of this building, finding pieces of it in ductwork and electrical panels. And it hadn't been enough. This might be different. He didn't know yet. He was suspicious of things he didn't know yet. But he'd walked back into a building that had humiliated him because 900 people were in the dark. And now he was sitting across a desk from the woman who'd humiliated him and making demands she was accepting, and something in the algebra of it felt not right exactly, not clean, but honest. And honest was a thing he could work with. The first 2 weeks were a calibration exercise in which everyone involved was pretending they weren't calibrating. Ethan settled into an office on the 36th floor that had previously been used as a secondary conference room and had been cleared out overnight with an efficiency that told him Claire had made this decision before he'd agreed to it. The office had a window that looked south, a desk, a laptop already configured with building access credentials, and no personal items because he hadn't brought any. He didn't put anything on the walls. He wasn't there to be comfortable. He was there to learn the building again. Not its bones, this time, but its face. He learned quickly that Meridian Corporation, in its executive functions, operated very differently than Meridian Tower in its mechanical ones. The building he'd known was honest in the way physical systems are honest. Things worked, or they didn't. Failures had causes. Causes had fixes. The company was more complicated. Its surface, the lobby, the annual reports, the careful presentation of Claire Ashford as a visionary CEO who had modernized a traditional industrial conglomerate, was polished in the specific way of things that are polished to prevent you from looking at what's underneath. He started looking underneath. He started doing it the way he'd always done anything, methodically, without announcement, paying attention to what people did rather than what they said. He sat in on operational reviews and watched who looked at whom when certain numbers came up. He walked the floors at different times of day and paid attention to which conversations stopped when he appeared and which didn't. He read the security logs, visitor access, after-hours badge activity, data transfer records, with the same patience he'd once applied to other kinds of surveillance in other places for different stakes. He didn't have a specific target. He was just listening. Claire, for her part, gave him room to work in a way that surprised him. She didn't check in daily, didn't ask for progress reports, didn't hover. She'd assigned him authority, and she let him use it. He gave her a weekly summary, 1 page, factual, no recommendations until he had enough data to support them. And she read them without comment, which meant she was thinking about them. Their working relationship was professional and slightly awkward in the way of two people who have started on wrong footing and are building something new on top of the rubble without quite acknowledging that that's what they're doing. She called him Walker. He called her Ms. Ashford. They were formal with each other in the way of people who have already seen each other in unguarded moments and are compensating for it. He noticed, because he noticed everything, that she worked late most nights, that she ate lunch at her desk more often than not, that the photographs on her office credenza included a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with Claire's coloring and her father's eyes in the only photograph that included a man, and that the man in that photograph was not in any of the others. He didn't ask about it. It wasn't his business, and he had rules about separating the things that were his business from the things that weren't. Ava asked about his new job on a Friday evening in their kitchen, the two of them eating takeout at the table because neither of them had cooked that week, and he'd run out of excuses. "So you're like her bodyguard now?" Ava said. She was picking the water chestnuts out of her fried rice with the focused disdain she reserved for water chestnuts and, inexplicably, the color orange. "Not exactly. More like I look for problems before they become problems. Like the transformer. Like that, yeah. But for people stuff, not building stuff." He looked at her. "When did you get smart?" She didn't dignify that with a response. "Do you like it?" He thought about it honestly, because she asked honest questions and deserved honest answers. "I think so. It's early." "Is she mean to you?" She apologized. Ava considered this, a water chestnut balanced on the edge of her fork. People who are mean and then apologize are either actually sorry or they want something. "Both can be true," he said. She thought about that. "Yeah," she said slowly. "Yeah, okay." She pushed the water chestnut off her fork and looked at him. "Can I meet her daughter sometime?" He blinked. "Why?" "Because you said she has a daughter about my age. And if you work there and I have to come by sometimes, it would be good to know someone." A pause. "Also, I don't really have anyone to eat lunch with on Tuesdays, and I've been sitting with the librarian, which is fine. She's nice, but she talks about cats a lot." He looked at his daughter for a moment. She was eating rice and not making anything of what she'd just said, which was how she operated when she'd said something true and slightly vulnerable. She moved past it quickly and let him catch up on his own time. "I'll see what I can do," he said. She nodded, went back to her rice. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing its evening thing, lights coming on across the skyline, Meridian Tower visible if you knew where to look, its upper floors lit against the darkening sky. He looked at it for a moment. Just a building, from this distance, no different from the others. And something shifted in him that he didn't quite have a name for. Not comfort, not resolution. Something more like the feeling of having taken the first step on a long road and realizing, with more surprise than was probably warranted, that the ground was solid under his feet. He looked back at his daughter and her rice and the water chestnuts she was quietly relocating to the edge of the container where she thought he wouldn't notice. And he thought, tomorrow is a different problem. Tonight is this one, and this one is fine. He ate his dinner and didn't look at the skyline again. The thing about surveillance, real surveillance, not the movie version with earpieces and rooftop snipers, is that it's mostly waiting. It's reading the same access log for the 4th time because something in the pattern is wrong and you haven't figured out what yet. It's sitting in a room with bad coffee and noticing that a person who is always early was 3 minutes late on a Tuesday and deciding whether that means anything. Most of the time it means nothing. Occasionally it means everything. The skill is in knowing the difference, and the only way to develop that skill is to be wrong enough times that you stop trusting your first read. Ethan had been in his 36th floor office for 3 weeks when he first noticed Miranda Cole. It wasn't dramatic. It was a data transfer log, routine review, the kind of thing he went through every Monday morning as part of his operational assessment, and a file access timestamp that was 4 minutes off from what it should have been. Miranda Cole was Claire Ashford's executive assistant, had been for 6 years, and her access patterns were so consistent they were almost boring. She logged in at 8:12 every morning, accessed the same categories of files in the same sequence, logged out between 6 and 6:30. The kind of pattern that develops when someone has done the same job long enough that it's become physical memory. On the Tuesday, 3 weeks after Ethan started, she'd accessed a subfolder within the Hargrove merger documents at 11:47 p.m. He looked at it for a while. Then he closed the log and went back to the rest of his morning. He made a note and told himself it was probably nothing. People worked late, people forgot things, people came back to their desks at odd hours. He had a rule about not constructing narratives from single data points. He waited another week. In that week, he made a point of paying more attention to Miranda Cole in the ordinary run of the workday. She was 41, efficient, competent in the focused way of people who have been doing one job for a long time and have built their identity around doing it well. She anticipated Claire's schedule, managed her calendar with the precision of a logistical operation, communicated in the careful, abbreviated shorthand of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible while remaining essential. She had a dry sense of humor that surfaced occasionally in small flashes. She brought her own lunch every day in a container she washed and reused, and she had a photograph on her desk of a younger woman who looked enough like her to be a sister or a daughter. She was also, Ethan noticed, very careful around him. Not unfriendly. She was never unfriendly, but careful. When he asked her questions, she answered them completely and without hesitation in the way of someone who had decided the best way to not seem evasive was to be entirely cooperative. When he walked past her desk, she didn't look up, but he'd learned to track peripheral awareness, and she always knew where he was in the room. He noted all of this and kept waiting. The second anomaly came 8 days later. Same subfolder, different document, 1:12 in the morning. Then 4 days after that, a third, this one not a file access but an external email, routed through the company's encrypted client communication server in a way that was technically within Miranda's access permissions, but that served no operational purpose he could identify. The recipient address was a consulting firm he hadn't heard of. He ran a check on it and found it had been incorporated 14 months ago in Delaware, listed 2 employees, had a website with the particular blankness of something created to exist rather than to function, and shared a registered agent with 3 other companies, one of which had a subsidiary relationship with Harrington Gage Capital Partners. Graham Bennett ran Harrington Gage Capital Partners. Ethan sat in his office for a long time after he found that. Not because he was surprised, exactly. He'd been looking for something, and he'd found a shape that fit, but because finding a shape that fit wasn't the same as having proof, and he knew the difference between those two things in a way that mattered. He had a pattern of anomalous access, a suspicious email chain, and a corporate connection that could be coincidental. What he didn't have was a direct link, something that put Miranda Cole and Graham Bennett in communication about Meridian's confidential merger data in a way that couldn't be explained away by a halfway decent attorney in a deposition. He needed more. And getting more without tipping his hand required the kind of patience he'd developed in circumstances where impatience got people killed. He didn't tell Claire yet. This decision bothered him in a specific way. Claire was his employer, the target of whatever was being done here, and there was an argument, a reasonable one, that she had the right to know immediately what he suspected. He turned that argument over several times and kept arriving at the same place. If he told her now, with what he had, one of 2 things would happen. Either she'd act on it prematurely, and Miranda would have enough warning to eliminate the evidence and walk away clean, or she'd disbelieve him and he'd lose credibility that would make the rest of his job harder. He needed 3 more things before he could bring it to her. A direct communication between Miranda and Bennett, confirmation of what had actually been transferred, and a timeline that placed the leaks in correlation with specific Hargrove negotiation setbacks that Ethan had heard referenced obliquely in board meeting minutes. He started building the case with the quiet deliberateness of a man who had learned to trust the process over the result. What he hadn't factored in, and what he should have, was that someone was watching him watch them. He found out on a Wednesday evening, leaving the building at 7:15 after a longer-than-planned review of the security camera archives from the previous month. He took the parking structure stairwell because the elevators at that hour were slow and he didn't like waiting in enclosed spaces, a habit from years of operating in environments where enclosed spaces had inconvenient histories. The stairwell on the 3rd level was badly lit, a maintenance ticket that had been sitting in the queue since before he'd taken the advisor role and that he'd flagged twice in writing without result. He came around the landing between levels 2 and 3, and someone came off the wall at him from the left. There were two of them. Not random. This was not a mugging. They were positioned correctly, moved with the deliberate coordination of people who had done this before, and the one who reached him first went for control rather than damage, which meant they wanted him contained rather than unconscious, which told him something important about who had sent them and what they needed. He processed all of this in approximately the first second and a half. What happened next took about 45 seconds and was not a clean sequence of moves. It was messy and physical, and he took an elbow to the jaw at some point that rattled his vision briefly and left him with a cut on the inside of his cheek. But 11 years in the Navy and a lifetime of training for situations where losing was not a recoverable option meant that messy and physical generally ended the same way for Ethan Walker. He put the first man down hard on the landing, hard enough to take the fight out of him without doing anything that would make the paperwork complicated, and the second one ran when it became clear the situation had shifted irreversibly in the wrong direction. He stood in the stairwell for a moment, breathing, checking himself, jaw aching, right hand scraped from the concrete, everything else functional. He looked at the man on the landing, who was conscious but choosing to remain still. Young, mid-20s, the particular look of someone who takes jobs without asking enough questions about them. Ethan crouched down and went through his jacket pockets, which is how he found the folded piece of paper with a parking structure name on it, and a time and the single line, Walker, Level 3, 7 p.m. written in handwriting that told him nothing about who'd written it. "Who hired you?" he said. The man on the landing said nothing. Was it Bennett? Still nothing, but something moved in the man's face when Ethan said the name. A micro-expression, the involuntary kind, gone in less than a second, which was answer enough. Ethan stood up. His jaw was going to bruise. He didn't like that. "Stay there for 10 minutes, he said. "Then go." He walked out of the stairwell and stood in the open air of the parking level for a moment, then took out his phone. He thought about calling Claire. He put the phone back in his pocket. Not yet. Now he had urgency, which meant he needed to move faster, which meant he needed to be smarter about it, which meant not making any move that could be read before he was ready for it to be read. He drove home. He didn't tell Ava about the stairwell. He told her he'd caught his jaw on a cabinet at the office, which she received with the particular expression she wore when she didn't believe him, but had decided not to press it. They ate dinner. He put her to bed. He sat at the kitchen table until almost midnight, running through what he had and what he still needed, and how much time he might have before another attempt was made that was better organized than the first one. By 11:50, he had a plan. It wasn't a comfortable plan, but it was the right one. Chad. The Hargrove merger board meeting was scheduled for the third Friday of the month, a standing event that had been on Meridian's calendar for 6 weeks. Ethan had attended the previous two as a peripheral presence, his chair at the table, as Claire had promised, but used quietly, mostly observing. He knew the rhythm of the meetings now, knew who sat where, who spoke when, who deferred to whom and why. He knew that Miranda Cole sat outside the boardroom door during these sessions, managing the flow of documents and messages, with access to the digital conference system that controlled presentation files and meeting records. He needed Miranda to try to access the Hargrove data one more time. He needed her to do it in a way he could document conclusively and that would be witnessed by enough people to be unambiguous. That meant he needed to give her a reason, something that made the risk worth taking, something time-sensitive enough that she couldn't wait for a safer moment. 3 days before the meeting, working alone after hours when the floor was empty, he made a modification to the Hargrove file structure. He created a document, labeled innocuously as a supplementary valuation appendix, that contained figures he'd constructed himself, numbers that would be extraordinarily valuable to a competing party preparing a counteroffer. He flagged the document internally with a quiet tracer protocol so that any access would be logged with precise metadata. He then made sure that Miranda's daily schedule review, which he knew she received each morning, would include a reference to this document as being added to the meeting materials. He gave it 2 days. On the evening before the board meeting, at 11:23 p.m., the tracer logged an access event, Miranda Cole's credentials, the supplementary valuation appendix, 6 minutes of open access and one file export to the external email server. He had it. He sat in his car in the parking structure, a different level, a different corner, and looked at the log on his phone for a long time. The cut on the inside of his cheek had mostly healed. His jaw had stopped aching after the third day. He thought about 9 months of service requests for a transformer that had eventually taken down an entire building. He thought about patterns and patience and the particular satisfaction of being right about something you'd wished you were wrong about. Then he called Claire. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the particular alertness of someone who hadn't been asleep but was surprised to be called. "Walker, it's almost midnight. I know, I need you to come into the office early tomorrow, 6 a.m., before anyone else is in." A pause. "That's not a request I usually get. There's something you need to see, and you need to see it before the board meeting." He kept his voice level. "It's about the Hargrove leaks." Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone processing. The silence of someone who has suspected something for a while and is hearing it confirmed. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough." She didn't ask him to elaborate over the phone, which told him she already understood the shape of the situation. 6 a.m., she said. "I'll be there." She was there at 5:50. He was already in his office. She came in without her assistant, without Philip Strand, without anyone, and sat across the desk from him in the gray pre-dawn light of the building and let him walk her through everything he had. The access logs from the beginning, the external email chain, the corporate connection to Harrington Gage, the parking structure, and finally, last night's tracer log. He laid it out methodically, without editorializing, without emotional framing, just the evidence in sequence. He'd learned a long time ago that the facts were most powerful when they were allowed to speak without help. Claire did not interrupt him. She sat with her hands flat on the desk, a stillness that wasn't calm but was controlled, and listened to everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Miranda," she said. Not a question. The word had a specific quality, like she was testing whether she could say it without something breaking. "Yes." 6 years. She looked at the wall briefly, then back at him. "She's been with me for 6 years. I know. She knows everything. Every negotiation, every internal dispute, every number we've tried to keep off the public record." She pressed her fingertips together. "How much has she given them?" "I can't quantify the full scope yet. What I can tell you is that the Hargrove valuation data she accessed last night would be enough for Bennett to walk into a counteroffer meeting and undercut your position significantly." He paused. "The board meeting is in 4 hours. Something sharpened in her face. "We need to involve legal. Philip should be in before 7, but before you bring anyone else in, you need to decide how you want to handle Miranda." "What do you mean?" "I mean, there are 2 ways to do this. You can have security escort her out before she arrives and let legal handle it from a distance. Clean, controlled, no drama." He looked at her. "Or you let her come in. Let her sit outside the boardroom like she always does. And when she tries to do what she's been doing, you catch her doing it in front of witnesses." Claire stared at him. "You want to let her walk into it. It's your call, not mine." "What's the argument for letting her walk in?" "The argument is that a witnessed real-time incident, documented and observed, is harder to dispute in a legal proceeding than log files, which any defense attorney will spend 6 months arguing were manipulated or misread." He kept his voice even. "And the argument against it is that it requires letting her get within reach of the meeting data one more time." "She won't get anywhere with it," Claire said. "Not if you're watching." "No," he said. "She won't." Claire was quiet for a full minute. He didn't fill the silence. She was thinking, and thinking deserved room. "Let her come in," she said. Again. The board meeting was scheduled for 9:30. By 8, Philip Strand was in the building and had been briefed in Claire's office with the door closed. By 8:45, 2 of Meridian's internal security staff, neither of them in uniform, both positioned to look like they belonged in the hallway, were in place on the 38th floor. Ethan had spent 20 minutes walking them through the positioning and what to watch for. He'd given them simple instructions: don't move until he moved. Miranda Cole arrived at 8:53, which was 6 minutes earlier than her usual time on meeting days, which told Ethan she was anxious. She set up at her station outside the boardroom. Laptop, 2 phones, the printed agenda packets she always prepared, with the practiced efficiency of someone performing a routine. She said good morning to the paralegal who came past with the coffee service. She answered an email. She did not look toward the security cameras, which was actually more telling than if she had, because it suggested a deliberate choice not to. The board members began arriving at 9:15. The Hargrove representatives, 4 of them today, including the 2 who'd been trapped in the elevator 2 months ago, came in together at 9:22. The room filled. Claire took her position at the head of the table. Ethan sat in his chair to her left. At 9:29, 1 minute before the meeting was scheduled to begin, the digital conference system showed an unauthorized file access attempt on the supplementary valuation document from a device on the 38th floor network, Miranda's workstation. Ethan stood up. He walked out of the boardroom without explaining himself, which caused a brief pause in the room behind him, and came around the corner to Miranda's station. She was looking at her laptop screen, one hand on the keyboard, and she looked up when she heard him coming, and he saw it in her face immediately, the way you see it in people who have been waiting for something bad to happen and have finally heard the knock at the door. Not panic, something closer to relief, which was the worst kind of guilt to witness because it meant the weight had been too heavy for too long. "Miranda," he said quietly. She took her hand off the keyboard. She didn't say anything. "I need you to step away from the workstation." Behind him, he heard the boardroom door open. Claire, followed by Philip and one of the positioned security staff. The paralegal who'd brought the coffee was standing in the hallway a few feet away, frozen, holding an empty tray. Miranda looked at Claire. Claire looked at Miranda. The hallway was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Miranda said. Her voice was steady, which was somehow worse. I know that doesn't help." "How long?" Claire said. 14 months. Miranda set her hands flat on the desk, a gesture almost identical to the one Claire had used that morning, which Ethan noted with the distant part of his brain that kept noting things. "Bennett approached me after the Westwick acquisition. He knew things about the internal structure. He'd done his homework. He knew I'd been passed over for the senior operations director position. He knew—" She stopped, started again. "He knew I was angry." "Were you?" Claire said. "Were you that angry at me?" Miranda looked at her. "I was angry for a long time before I made a choice. And then I made a bad one. And then I made it again and again, because there was no way back." Her eyes were dry, but her jaw was tight. "I'm not asking you to understand it." "Good," Claire said, "because I don't." Philip moved forward and spoke quietly to Miranda about the process, the security escort, the legal hold on her devices, the HR documentation. Miranda listened and nodded and said yes in the right places. She stood when they asked her to stand. She picked up her personal phone, not the work one, and her jacket from the back of her chair, and she left the way she'd arrived, through the main corridor, with Philip and the security staff beside her, with the particular dignity of someone who has decided that whatever else happens, they're going to walk out on their own feet. The paralegal had vanished. The hallway was empty except for Ethan and Claire. Claire stood looking at the space where Miranda had been. She had her hands crossed over her chest, not hugging herself exactly, more like holding something in. There was a board meeting happening 20 feet away with 4 representatives of the company she'd spent 2 years trying to close the most important deal of her career, and she was standing in a hallway, not moving. "Are you okay?" Ethan said. She looked at him. "No." A pause. "I will be. In about 10 minutes, I'm going to walk back in there and explain to the Hargrove team that we had an internal security situation that has been fully resolved and that the integrity of the merger documents is uncompromised. And I'm going to do that because I don't have a choice." She uncrossed her arms. "But right now, no, I'm not okay." "That's a reasonable response," he said. "Graham Bennett." She said the name the way you say something you want to spit out. "He's been doing this for 14 months and I didn't see it. You had no reason to look. You found it in 3 weeks. I was looking for it. That's different." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted in a way that didn't resolve into anything he could name. It stayed in motion, whatever it was. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why were you looking? You'd been in the job 3 weeks. You could have done what the last security chief did and reviewed the perimeter logs and called it a day. Why were you already inside the data transfer records?" He thought about how to answer that, honestly, which was the only way he knew. "Because the building's bones were bad and nobody was paying attention," he said. "I didn't know if that was just the infrastructure or if it went further, so I looked further." She held his gaze. "You've been looking out for this company since before you had a reason to." He didn't have a response to that. It was true and she knew it was true, and saying yes would have felt like posturing. "We should go back in," he said. She straightened. The thing in her face resolved, not into composure exactly, but into readiness, which was different and in its own way more real. "Yes," she said. She went back through the boardroom door first. He followed. As he came through the door, he caught one of the Hargrove representatives, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who'd been the most skeptical voice across every meeting, watching him with the evaluating look of someone who has just revised their estimate of a situation. He didn't acknowledge it. He sat back down in his chair, and Claire took her place at the head of the table, and the meeting resumed. She was good in the room, He'd seen her work before, but not under this specific kind of pressure. The pressure of having had something fall apart 45 minutes ago and needing to present as someone who has never had anything fall apart. She explained the security situation in 4 sentences, precise and without deflection, answered 2 follow-up questions directly, and then moved the conversation forward with the particular momentum of someone who has decided the past is a closed subject, and the future is the only thing worth addressing. The Hargrove representatives did not walk out. The meeting ran 93 minutes and ended with a handshake and a scheduled follow-up for the following Tuesday. When the last board member had cleared the room, Ethan remained at the table with Philip Strand, going through the documentation chain for the legal hold on Miranda's devices. It was procedural work, the kind that gets done after the dramatic part is over and that matters just as much and is considerably less interesting. He went through it carefully because careful mattered. Philip, at some point, said without particular inflection, "She trusted Miranda completely, for 6 years." "I know," Ethan said. "That kind of thing takes a while to process." Ethan looked at him. Philip was not a man who made small talk. "What are you saying, Philip?" Philip gathered his papers. "I'm saying it's been a hard morning, and Claire Ashford doesn't have a large number of people she lets herself rely on." He stood. "That's all I'm saying." He left the room. Ethan sat for a moment in the empty boardroom, the city spread out through the window wall in the afternoon light, the meeting table cleared except for his own folder and a forgotten coffee cup near the far end. He thought about Ava, who had asked last week about meeting Claire's daughter. He thought about the photograph on Claire's credenza, the one with the man who wasn't in any of the other photographs. He thought about people carrying things alone for too long because they'd convinced themselves that was the only option. He picked up his folder and walked out of the boardroom. Down the hall, Claire's office door was closed. He didn't knock. He went back to his own office, sat down, and wrote his incident report for the Miranda Cole situation. Factual, sequenced, thorough. No editorializing, just the evidence in order and what had been done with it and what came next. That was the job. He did the job. Outside the window, the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in a city, catching the glass of other buildings, going golden at the edges, making everything look briefly more considered than it actually was. He finished the report and sent it to Philip and saved a copy to the secure server and closed his laptop. Then he sat for another minute and allowed himself, just for that minute, to feel the particular exhaustion of a day that had started at 5:47 in the morning and had required at various points more of him than he usually put a number on. Then he picked up his jacket and went to get his daughter from school, because it was Thursday, and on Thursday she had art class that ended at 4, and she liked when he was there before she had to wait. He was there before she had to wait. Graham Bennett was arrested on a Thursday morning, 6 days after the board meeting, when federal investigators executed a search warrant on Harrington Gage Capital Partners' offices and found, among other things, a folder of documents on his personal server that matched, page for page, the supplementary valuation appendix Ethan had created as a trap. The tracer metadata embedded in the file was still intact. His attorney released a statement that said his client intended to cooperate fully with the investigation, which was the kind of statement attorneys release when cooperation is the only remaining option. Ethan found out about the arrest from a news alert on his phone while he was in the parking structure at 6:50 in the morning, before he'd even made it to the elevator. He read the 2-paragraph breaking notice twice, put his phone in his pocket, and stood in the concrete quiet of the structure for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets. Then he got in the elevator and went to his office. Claire came by at 8:15. She knocked, which she didn't always do. Sometimes she came in mid-sentence, already talking, the way driven people do when their minds are moving faster than the social conventions around them. The knock was different. He told her to come in. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she entered, which was also not her usual manner. She looked like someone who had slept and was surprised to have been able to. "You saw the news," she said. "This morning." She sat down across from his desk, the same chair she'd been using since the first time she came to his office, which he'd noted without assigning meaning to. "Philip says the federal case is solid. The documents they found on his server, combined with the communication records from Miranda's external email chain, make the conspiracy charge straightforward." "That's what I'd expect." "Miranda's cooperating too. She's been talking to investigators since Tuesday." Claire looked at her hands briefly, then back at him. "Philip thinks she'll get a reduced charge for the cooperation. Probably civil penalties rather than criminal prosecution." Ethan said nothing. He'd already thought through the likely legal outcomes and had no particular position on them. That wasn't his part of this. "Does that bother you?" Claire said. "That she might not face criminal charges?" He thought about it. "She made a bad choice for a long time. She also helped bring it down when it mattered." He shrugged slightly. "That's for the courts to weigh, not me." Claire studied him. "Most people in your position would be angrier." "Most people in my position were never in my position," he said. "I've seen what happens when you run on anger. It's not a sustainable fuel." She was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, the city was doing its morning thing, fully awake now, all noise and motion and indifference. "The board wants to make a public statement about the security breach," she said. "They want it framed as, they want to talk about how it was discovered and resolved without—" She stopped, her jaw tightening slightly. "They want it to sound controlled, like we knew all along." "Did you want it to sound controlled?" She met his eyes. "What I want is to tell people what actually happened, which is that we had a 14-month security failure that we didn't catch, and that we caught it when someone was finally paying attention, and that what it cost us was significant, and we're not going to pretend otherwise." She paused. "Philip thinks that's too exposed." "What do you think?" "I think companies that lie about their failures don't fix them. They just get better at hiding them." She said it flatly, without heat, the tone of someone who has arrived at a conclusion by a long and uncomfortable route. "I want to make an honest statement. I want to stand in front of the board and the Hargrove team and say, this happened, here's how, here's who found it, and here's what we're doing differently." Ethan looked at her. Something had shifted in her over the past weeks. Not dramatically, nothing you could point to in a single moment, but in the accumulated way that people change when circumstances require it, and they don't resist. The edge she'd carried in the executive lounge that first morning was still there, but it was different now, less automatic, more chosen. She was still sharp, but she was starting to be sharp with more purpose. "Then say that," he said. "The board won't love it." "No," he said, "but the Hargrove team will respect it, and that's the relationship you actually need to protect." She nodded slowly, the nod of someone confirming something they'd already decided. "There's one more thing." She looked at him with the direct, slightly uncomfortable quality she sometimes had when she was about to say something she'd been turning over for a while. "I want to say something publicly about you, about your role in finding the breach. I want to credit you by name." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because it's accurate. It's going to raise questions about how you hired a former maintenance worker as a senior security advisor." "Yes." A beat. "Questions I should have to answer." He sat with that. It was a statement that had cost her something to make. He could hear the cost in the flatness of it, the same way she'd said I made a mistake in the early morning of the day he'd come back. She was not a person who found accountability easy. That made it mean more, not less, when she practiced it. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated. She didn't move to leave immediately. That was unusual. Claire Ashford was a person who moved from thing to thing with the efficient momentum of someone who had more things than time. Sitting still, in someone else's space, with nothing pressing on her right this moment, that was not her default. "How's Ava?" she said. The question caught him slightly sideways, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was unexpected. A personal question offered without any surrounding context to make it feel less personal. "She's good," he said. "She has a science presentation next week she's very intense about." "What's it on?" "Ocean pressure systems." She decided on the topic herself, which I probably should have seen coming given that she spent 3 weeks last spring completely obsessed with how submarines work. Something moved across Claire's face. Not a full smile, but the antechamber of one. "Sophia's in an ocean phase 2 right now. She has a poster of deep-sea creatures on her bedroom door that I find genuinely unsettling." "Ava has one of those too," he said. "The anglerfish." "Yes?" Claire shook her head. "The anglerfish." They sat for a moment in the unlikely mutual territory of parents united by their children's enthusiasm for deep-sea predators, which was not a conversational space either of them had navigated with each other before, and which was somehow easier than most of the spaces they'd occupied together. "Ava asked me about meeting Sophia," he said. "A while ago. I told her I'd see what I could do, and then I didn't follow up on it." "Sophia's been asking too." Claire looked mildly surprised by herself for saying it. "She knows Ava exists from things I've mentioned, and she has a lot of opinions about her already." "What kind of opinions?" "That she sounds interesting, and that she'd like to have someone to eat lunch with who isn't a grown-up." A pause. "She has lunch with her school's guidance counselor on Tuesdays because she says the other kids are loud, which is accurate to who she is, but also something I worry about." He understood that. He worried about Ava's Tuesday lunches with the librarian who talked about cats for the exact same reason. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but because you wanted more for your kid than that. You wanted them to have their own people. "Saturday," he said, "if Sophia's free. There's a place near the waterfront Ava likes. They have good grilled cheese and the worst lemonade you've ever tasted in your life. She loves it there." Claire looked at him for a moment. "Is that an invitation?" "It is." "Then yes," she said. "Saturday works." She left shortly after, and Ethan sat in his office for a few minutes after she'd gone, not quite doing anything, which was unusual for him. He was aware that something had moved between them in the past 20 minutes. Nothing large, nothing cinematic, just a small and incremental crossing of a line that had been there since the executive lounge, since the badge, since the morning he'd come back. He didn't know what to do with the awareness, except to sit with it honestly and not make it into anything it wasn't yet. He was good at that. He'd had practice. The public statement went out on a Friday afternoon, timed for maximum reach among financial press. It was 4 paragraphs written by Claire with Philip's legal review and with Ethan's input on the security section, and it said exactly what she'd said she wanted it to say: what had happened, who had done it, and who had found it. His name appeared in the 3rd paragraph, with his title and a brief description of his background. By Monday morning, 3 financial publications had run pieces on the Meridian security breach, and 2 of them had led with the detail about a former Navy SEAL and ex-maintenance worker who'd identified the conspiracy from inside the company. He didn't read any of the articles in full. He got the summaries from Philip, filed them, and moved on. What he couldn't move on from quite as easily was the board meeting that followed on Monday afternoon, not because it was difficult, but because of what Claire did in it. She stood at the head of the table in front of 14 board members and the Hargrove leadership team, and she said, "I made a serious error in judgment 4 months ago when I terminated the employment of a member of our maintenance team for a procedural matter that I handled badly and publicly. The person I terminated was Ethan Walker. He came back to this building 22 minutes after I fired him, restored power to 42 floors of active occupancy, and over the following weeks identified a 14-month corporate espionage operation that could have cost this company the Hargrove merger and significantly more. I want this board to understand that the way I treated him was wrong, and that his response to that treatment is not something I deserved. The room was very quiet. Ethan, sitting to her left in his usual chair, looked at the table surface and did not look at her while she was saying it. He was aware that 14 people in the Hargrove team were also not quite sure where to look, which was the particular discomfort of a room full of people witnessing something genuinely honest in a context that doesn't usually accommodate it. She moved on after that into the operational agenda, crisp and forward-facing, and the meeting found its rhythm. But afterward, in the corridor outside, one of the Hargrove representatives, the sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who'd been the skeptic from the beginning, whose name was Carolyn Vance and who had said more with her silences across meetings than most people said out loud, stopped next to Ethan while Claire was speaking to Philip 20 feet away. "That was an unusual thing," Carolyn Vance said, "for a CEO to do in front of her board." "Yes," Ethan said. "It suggests she's changed her thinking on something." "She has." Carolyn looked at him with the frank appraisal of someone who has been evaluating people professionally for 40 years. "You have something to do with that?" He thought about the honest answer. "The situation had something to do with it. I was just in the situation." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that direction, and moved on. He watched her go and thought about what she'd said. The situation had something to do with it. That was true as far as it went. It just wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was harder to articulate because it involved the incremental, unannounced way that two people can change each other simply by being in proximity and being honest and not looking away from the parts that were uncomfortable. He didn't have a cleaner way to say it than that, so he didn't try. Saturday arrived the way November Saturdays in the city arrive, gray and cool, with the particular light that makes everything look slightly more considered than it actually is, the kind of day that doesn't make promises. Ethan and Ava walked to the waterfront place, which was called something forgettable and known to both of them entirely as the grilled cheese place, and arrived 8 minutes before the time he'd said. Ava had been quiet on the walk over in the way she got quiet when something mattered to her, not withdrawn, just internal, processing. She'd asked 3 questions that morning while he was making breakfast. Was Sophia nice? How did he know? And did she have to be funny? Because sometimes she felt pressure to be funny when she met people and it made her jokes worse. He'd told her he didn't know if Sophia was nice, that he had a reasonable basis to think so, and that she absolutely did not have to be funny, at which point she'd said she knew that, but it was different knowing it and feeling it, which was true enough that he didn't have a follow-up for it. Claire and Sophia arrived 11 minutes later. He saw them through the window before they came in. Claire in a dark coat, hands in her pockets, and beside her a girl who was smaller than he'd pictured, with her mother's dark coloring and a self-possessed quality that was visible even at a distance, even before she'd said a word. She was looking at the restaurant front with an expression of careful evaluation. They came in, and there was the brief, charged moment of introduction that happens when children are introduced to each other in adult contexts. The mutual sizing up, the performance of normal that both parties are slightly too aware of. Sophia shook Ava's hand, which Ava received with visible surprise and then visible respect. "That's a very formal handshake," Ava said. "My mom says if you don't know someone yet, a handshake is better than assuming they want to hug." Ava thought about this. "That's actually really reasonable." "I know." Sophia looked at the menu board on the wall. "Is the grilled cheese actually good here, or is it good in the way where you just like it because you're used to it?" "Both," Ava said, "but mostly actually good." They sat across from each other in the booth, and within 4 minutes were discussing the deep-sea creature poster situation, which moved immediately into a disagreement about whether anglerfish or giant isopods were more interesting, which escalated into a conversation of such specific enthusiasm that Ethan and Claire, sitting beside their respective daughters, found themselves slightly outside the radius of the discussion. He looked at Claire over the table. She was watching the girls with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the thing underneath a smile. Relief, maybe, or something adjacent to it. something that had been wound tight and had loosened a few turns. "Giant isopods," Claire said quietly to him. "Ava's going to say anglerfish. Sophia will argue for 20 minutes. Ava will also argue for 20 minutes. This is going to be a long lunch." "Yeah," he said. "It is." The food came. The lemonade was exactly as bad as advertised. Sophia tasted it, made a face of absolute genuine horror, and said, "Why do people order this?" with such earnest bewilderment that Ava started laughing. Real laughing, the unself-conscious kind. And then Sophia started too, and the thing between them cracked open into something easier and more real. Claire watched them, and then looked at Ethan. "You have grilled cheese on your sleeve," she said. He looked down. He did. He picked it off. "Thanks." She almost smiled. He almost smiled back. They ate their lunch in the gray November light with their daughters arguing about deep-sea creatures across the table, and neither of them said anything particularly significant, and it was one of the better Saturday afternoons he'd had in a long time. The weeks after Bennett's arrest and Miranda's departure had a particular quality, the quality of aftermath, where things that were broken are being assessed and decisions are being made about what to rebuild and how. It was not a triumphant period. It was a working one. Ethan spent a significant portion of it in conversations he hadn't anticipated having. The first were with the maintenance team, Marcus, Danny, Rosa, who were now technically under his operational authority and who had opinions about that situation that varied. Marcus had simply said, "All right then," and gotten back to work, which was the maximum amount of acknowledgement he was ever going to offer. Danny had asked 3 questions in the wrong order and then apologized for the questions. Rosa had come to his office on a Thursday afternoon and sat across from him with the directness she brought to everything and said, "I want to make sure this means the repair requests get acted on." "Yes," he said. "The transformer was on the list for 9 months." "I know." "So was the south stairwell lighting." "Also on my list." She looked at him. "Okay," she said, and stood up and left. That was Rosa. The second set of conversations was harder. Claire had decided, in the aftermath of the public statement and the board meeting, that the cultural practices inside Meridian needed examination. Not just security protocols, but the way the organization treated the people inside it, particularly the ones below the executive floor. She asked Ethan to be part of those conversations, which meant sitting in rooms with HR leadership and department heads, and occasionally Claire herself, going through the gap between how the company described its values and how it actually operated. These conversations were uncomfortable for everyone in them. Ethan was not a natural consultant. He didn't frame things in the language of organizational development, didn't soften his observations into palatable suggestions. When asked what he thought was wrong with Meridian's internal culture, he said, "You have a building full of people who keep the place running and a leadership structure that has spent years looking past them." Miranda Cole wasn't the first person who decided her resentment outweighed her loyalty. She was just the one who got caught. The room was quiet after that. Claire, across the table, said, "What would you change?" He thought about it. "Start with the basics. The repair request backlog, the access issues that get raised and ignored, the maintenance reports that go to 3 levels of management and come back approved for action and then don't get acted on." He looked around the table. People leave because they feel invisible, not always because the pay is wrong. You fix invisible, and you fix a lot of other things downstream. It wasn't a revelation, he knew that. But sometimes the obvious things have to be said out loud by someone with standing to say them before they become actionable. And that was what he was there for. The programs that developed from those conversations took shape slowly, the way institutional change always does, unevenly, with resistance at certain levels and genuine enthusiasm at others, with setbacks and revisions, and the occasional meeting where everything he'd said the previous week seemed to have been heard and processed and then quietly set aside. He pushed back when it mattered and let things move at their own speed when they needed to. One of the things Claire pushed for was a veteran hiring initiative, a structured pathway for former military personnel entering civilian employment, with mentorship support and role placement based on actual skill assessment rather than civilian credential equivalencies. She brought it to him as an idea first, in his office on a Tuesday evening, and he listened to the whole proposal before he said anything. "You're building this for me," he said. "I'm building it because it should exist," she said. "The fact that you're the reason I see that isn't the same as building it for you." He considered that distinction. Fair. Do you think it'll work? I think the mentorship component needs to be led by people who've actually been through the transition, not by HR staff who've read about it. That's the part that'll make it real or not. She made a note. "Would you run that component?" "Yes," he said. "I would." She wrote something down and didn't look up when she said, "I also want to expand it to single parents. There's a gap in what the city offers for working single parents who are trying to get back into professional tracks after time away." A pause. "I've been on that side of it. Not in the same way you have, but I know what it costs." He looked at her. She was still writing, not looking at him, which was sometimes how she said the things she wasn't sure she wanted to say directly. "The childcare component," he said. "That's the piece that kills re-entry for most people." "I know." She capped her pen. "I'm talking to 3 organizations about a partnership structure. It'll take 6 months to set up properly." She looked at him finally. "I want it to be real, not performative. I need someone to hold me to that." "I can do that," he said. She nodded, set her notepad aside. The office was quiet. Late afternoon going toward evening, the city light shifting outside, the particular stillness of a building that had mostly emptied for the day. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You're going to whether I say yes or not." She almost laughed. "Your wife." She said it carefully, giving it room. "Ava's mother. I've never heard you mention her. I'm not asking for details, She died," he said. "When Ava was 2, car accident." Claire was quiet. "I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago." He paused. "Long enough that I've stopped thinking of it as a wound all the time. Most of the time it's just the shape of things, the way our life is arranged. But some of the time it's still a wound, yeah." She looked at her hands. "Sophia's father left," she said. "Not died. Left, which is a different kind of loss because you spend a long time waiting for it to make sense and it doesn't." She wasn't looking at him. "Sophia doesn't remember him much. I don't know if that's better or not." "I don't know either," he said. "I think it depends on the day." She nodded. "Yeah." A pause. "It depends on the day." They sat in the quiet office for a moment, 2 people who had each been carrying their particular damage for long enough that they'd built lives around it, and then found, unexpectedly, that they were sitting across from someone who understood the specific weight of it without needing it explained. He didn't know what to do with that. He was still working that out. What he knew was that it didn't feel like something to run from, which was how he'd always known something mattered, not by the way it pulled him toward it, but by the absence of the familiar instinct to move away. "The programs," he said, returning to something solid. "The timeline you mentioned for the veteran component, 6 months is probably right for the structure, but we could run a pilot with 10 or 12 placements in the first quarter if we move on the partnership agreements now." She picked up her notepad again. "Tell me what that looks like." He told her. She wrote it down. They worked until the city outside had gone fully dark and the building around them was quiet in the way of places that rest between their busy hours, and neither of them noticed exactly when the conversation stopped being about programs and started being about other things, or when the other things became easy enough to say out loud that they just said them. That was how it happened mostly. Not in a moment, in a lot of small, unremarkable ones, accumulating. Ava told him on a Sunday morning, without preamble, that she thought Miss Ashford was actually a pretty good person once you got past the outer layer, and that Sophia had texted her 6 times the day before about a documentary on deep-sea vents that they should watch together. "That's a lot of texts," he said. "She's very enthusiastic about deep-sea vents," Ava said. She poured cereal into her bowl. "You like her, don't you, Miss Ashford?" He looked at his daughter. She was 8 years old and eating cereal and watching him with the patient, clear-eyed quality she'd had since she could walk, the quality he suspected she'd been born with. "It's more complicated than like," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm 8, not stupid." He sat down across from her and poured his own coffee, and they ate breakfast together in the Sunday morning light, and he thought about complicated things and simple ones and which category the important things usually fell into. Simple, mostly. The important things were almost always simple. They were just hard. The pilot program launched on a Tuesday in early February, which was not a glamorous day for a launch. Gray sky, cold rain, the particular misery of a winter morning that has no interest in symbolism. 12 veterans. 8 single parents returning to professional employment after gaps ranging from 2 years to 7. A conference room on the 22nd floor of Meridian Tower with folding tables and coffee that was better than the stuff Ethan used to drink in the maintenance break room, but still not great. He stood at the front of the room and looked at the 20 people sitting in front of him and felt, briefly, the specific discomfort of being the person at the front of the room rather than the person in the chairs. He'd spent most of his adult life being useful in ways that didn't require him to stand somewhere and talk about it. This was different. He was still getting used to different. "I'm not going to tell you this program is going to solve anything," he said. "It's going to give you a structure and some connections and a few months of supported placement. What you do with that is yours." He looked around the room. Some of you have been out of professional environments for a while. Some of you left jobs that the civilian world doesn't have a box for. This is a place where we try to figure out what the box should actually be, based on what you can actually do. A man in the third row, late 30s, the particular stillness of someone who had been in the military long enough for it to become posture, raised his hand. "Who's running the mentorship component?" "I am," Ethan said, along with 3 other people who've been through similar transitions. "We're not consultants. We're people who were where you are and figured some of it out." "What branch?" the man said. "Navy. SEALs." The man nodded once, the nod of someone recalibrating. "How long out?" 4 years? A pause. "Spent 2 of them fixing air conditioning systems for a company that fired me when I walked into the wrong room." A few people in the room reacted, some with recognition, some with the uncomfortable laughter of people who have their own versions of that story. The man in the third row didn't laugh, but something in his face opened slightly, which was more useful than laughter. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Ethan said. "Let's get started." He learned their names over the following weeks with the same methodical attention he gave to everything. Not just the names, but the specifics, the texture of each person's situation. There was a woman named Deb who had spent 9 years as an Army logistics coordinator and could not get a civilian supply chain company to look past the fact that her degree was incomplete. There was a man named Carl who had left a marketing career to care for his mother for 5 years and was now, at 44, trying to re-enter a field that had changed substantially while he was away. There was a 29-year-old named Yolanda who had 2 kids, a 2-year employment gap, and a specific practical competence that had no formal credential attached to it. He worked with each of them differently because each of them needed different things, which was something the program had built in, but that only functioned because the people running it were paying actual attention. The first month was the hardest, not because the participants struggled, but because the institutional machinery around the program moved with the friction of anything new trying to embed itself inside something established. There were HR processes that hadn't been updated to accommodate the placements. There were department heads who had signed on to the program in meetings and were less enthusiastic when it translated to actual people in their actual teams. There were moments when Ethan sat across from someone with a genuine skill set and a clean record and a real desire to work and felt the dull, specific anger of watching a system make that harder than it needed to be. He didn't run on anger, but he let it be useful in smaller doses, the fuel for the meetings where he had to push back, the engine behind the 3rd and 4th follow-up email when the first 2 hadn't moved anything. He was not a patient man by nature. He had gotten good at the behavior without losing the impatience, which meant he moved faster inside the patience than most people did. Rosa got promoted in March. He'd recommended her for the facilities operations manager position that opened when the previous manager retired, and the recommendation had included a level of specificity about her capabilities that had apparently distinguished it from the usual HR language. She came to his office when she heard and stood in the doorway with the particular expression she wore when she was processing something she hadn't expected. "You did that," she said. "You earned it," he said. "I just wrote it down." She stood there for another moment. "Thank you," she said, in a tone that made clear the conversation was over, which was exactly the right tone for the moment. She left. He went back to what he'd been reading. Marcus, when he heard about Rosa, came by and said, "About time." And that was the full extent of the celebration, which was appropriate. Danny got better at tools. This was noted by everyone, but commented on only by Ethan, who told him directly in April that his diagnostic work on the HVAC retrofit on floors 28 through 31 had been solid. Danny looked like he'd been told he'd won something, which Ethan found both endearing and slightly concerning for a man of 26, and which told him something about how rarely Danny had heard straightforward acknowledgement from anyone in authority. He made a note of that and made sure it happened more regularly. The small repairs mattered. That was something Ethan kept coming back to, not as a principle stated in meetings, but as something he watched play out in the daily operation of a building and a company and a program. The repair requests that had sat on backlogs for 9 months. The veteran who needed someone to translate his experience into language a civilian employer could understand. The single parent who needed the childcare arrangement to be solved before she could solve anything else. None of these were dramatic problems. None of them were invisible either, once you were actually looking. The thing about not looking was that it was almost never deliberate. People didn't choose to ignore the maintenance staff or the employee who'd been passed over or the process that had stopped working 3 years ago. They were just focused on other things, bigger things, things that felt more urgent, and the smaller things accumulated in the background until they became the transformer that took down 42 floors of an occupied building on a Tuesday morning. He'd thought about that a lot in the months since. The transformer. The 9 months of requests. The 4 minutes it had taken the whole system to collapse once the primary grid went down. He thought about what it would have cost Meridian, in money, in reputation, in actual human safety, if the building had stayed dark. He thought about the fact that it very nearly had, and that the margin between catastrophe and recovery had been a man who knew where the access hatch was and what tools to bring. The margin was always something like that, he'd found. It was rarely a grand intervention. It was usually somebody paying attention when everyone else was too busy to bother. Claire signed the formal documentation establishing the Walker Ashford Foundation in late April. The name had been her suggestion and his initial resistance and eventually his acceptance, which had taken approximately 3 weeks and one conversation where she'd said, flat and direct as she always was when she'd made up her mind, "You put your name on the things you build, otherwise people can't find them later." He'd thought about that and decided she was right. The foundation was structured to support 3 tracks: veteran employment transition, single-parent professional reentry, and what they'd called the infrastructure track, a clunky name for a program that identified and funded repairs to the physical and operational systems of mid-size organizations before those systems became crises. That last one had been Ethan's addition, suggested with some irony, accepted without any. At the signing, which was not an event with a press release or a photographer, but a meeting in Philip Strand's conference room with legal documents and coffee and Philip's quietly pleased expression, he made the expression of a man who is pleased about something without being willing to say so directly, which Ethan had come to understand was simply Philip's face. Claire sat across from Ethan and signed her name and pushed the document across to him. He looked at the signature line, his name above it, already printed in the formal type that legal documents use. Ethan Walker. He picked up the pen. "You're thinking about the badge," Claire said. He looked up. "The day I took your badge," she said. "You're thinking about it." He wasn't, actually. He'd been thinking about the access hatch on sublevel 2 and the smell of burned insulation and Ava on the concrete planter with her rabbit, waiting. But he understood why she thought that. "No," he said. "I'm thinking about what it cost to get here." "Same thing, maybe." "Not really." He looked at the document. The badge was just a thing that happened. The cost was everything after. He signed his name. The cost is usually everything after. She looked at him across Philip's conference table. The late afternoon light was doing that thing it did in this building in April, coming through the western exposure at an angle that caught the surface of things and made them briefly more visible. He'd noticed that particular quality of light in this building before, in different rooms, in different seasons, And it always did the same thing, made ordinary objects briefly distinct, briefly worth looking at. "Philip," Claire said, without looking away from Ethan, "can you give us a minute?" Philip gathered his papers with the practiced efficiency of a man who has learned to clear rooms quickly and without comment. The door closed behind him. "I want to say something, and I want to say it here because this feels like the right place," Claire said. She had her hands flat on the table, the gesture she made when she was going to say something she'd been working up to. "I've spent 2 years running this company in a way that prioritized. I had a version of strength that was about not needing anything, not needing help, not needing people to know things about me, not needing anyone to be in the room when things went wrong." She paused. "That version of strength has a significant cost, and I've been paying it for a long time." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you because you're the reason I can see it clearly. Not because you fixed it. You didn't fix it. I had to do that part myself. But because you—" She stopped, tried again. "Because you came back into the building 22 minutes after I treated you like you were nothing. And you didn't come back to prove a point. You came back because people were in the dark, and you knew the way out." She looked at him. "That's not a skill. That's who you are." He sat with that. It wasn't comfortable, Swills. He didn't have a natural habitat for being seen clearly. Most of his adult life had been about being useful in ways that didn't require the person you were being useful to understand what it cost. That was how he'd wanted it. That was what he'd built. He was looking at the thing he'd built and noticing, for the first time with full honesty, what it had kept out along with everything else. "I've been alone for a long time," he said, "by design, because it was simpler." "I know," she said. "I've done the same thing. It stops being simpler at some point." "Yes," she said. "It does." They looked at each other across Philip's conference table with the signed foundation documents between them and the late April light doing its work on the surfaces of things. It was not a moment from a film. No one had scored it, no one was watching, and both of them were aware of the slight awkwardness of two people who had spent months building walls around themselves, finding that the walls were lower than they'd thought. "I'd like to have dinner with you," he said. "Not a work dinner." She didn't hesitate. "Yes. This week, if you're free." "Thursday," she said. "Sophia's at her grandmother's. Ava's with Mrs. Garza on Thursdays." "Then Thursday," she said. They gathered the documents and went back to work. He told Ava that night, not the whole conversation, some conversations were his own, but the relevant part, that he was having dinner with Ms. Ashford on Thursday, that it was not a work thing. Ava was at the kitchen table doing homework, a worksheet of some kind spread out in front of her with half the answers filled in and the pencil tapping against the table in the irregular rhythm she made when she was thinking. She stopped tapping when he said it. "Like a date?" she said. "Yeah." She looked at him for a moment. "Does she know it's a date?" "We both know." She tapped the pencil twice more. "Okay," she said, and went back to the worksheet. He waited. He knew her. "That's it?" he said. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know, something." She set the pencil down and looked at him with the full weight of her attention, which was considerable for an 8-year-old. "I like her," she said. "I liked her when I met her. I like that she told you she was wrong about the thing with the badge, even though it was hard for her. I like that Sophia is weird about deep-sea creatures because it means she's the kind of person who gets really into things." She paused. "I like that you seem—" She searched for the word. "Less alone. You seem less alone lately." He looked at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and a quality that was entirely her own. This clear-eyed, unsparing affection that she deployed without sentimentality, as pure as good water. "Come here," he said. She came around the table and let him pull her into a hug, which she accepted for approximately 4 seconds before pulling back with the dignity of a person who had agreed to the hug, but was not going to let it become excessive. "Don't be weird about it," she said. "I'm not being weird about it." "You had the face." "I don't have a face." "Dad, you absolutely have a face." She went back to her chair and picked up her pencil. "It's a good face, but it's a face." He sat down across from her, and they finished the evening the way they always did. Him with his coffee and whatever he was reviewing, her with her homework and then her book, And then the slightly too long negotiation about bedtime that they performed every night like a ritual neither of them had any intention of abandoning. He turned off her light at 9:15, which was 15 minutes later than it should have been because she'd been at a good part in the book, and he'd found he couldn't make himself interrupt it. He stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment after, in the quiet of the apartment that was small and had a water stain on the bedroom ceiling and a carpet pulling up at the front corner. And he thought about all the things that had happened between one Tuesday morning in September and this Thursday night in May that he was standing in a hallway thinking about. The badge, the stairwell, the signed document on Philip's conference table, the restaurant with the bad lemonade, and the girls arguing about anglerfish. The things you build without meaning to. The things that build you. He and Claire had dinner at a place she chose, small and not fancy, the kind of restaurant that takes food seriously without making you feel watched for choosing the wrong fork. She was already there when he arrived, which surprised him. He'd been early, and she'd been earlier. "You're early," he said, sitting down. "I'm always early," she said. "I didn't want to make you wait, and also I needed 10 minutes to stop thinking about the quarterly projections." "Did it work?" "Mostly." She looked at the menu, then set it down. "Can I tell you something that might be strange to say?" "You usually do." The almost smile. "I was nervous getting here tonight. I haven't been nervous about something personal in, I can't remember how long. I've been nervous about deals and board meetings and earnings calls, but that's a different kind of nervous. That's operational anxiety." She looked at him. "This was the other kind." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She looked slightly relieved by that, which made her look younger, not in a performative way, just in the way that people look younger when they stop bracing. "Okay," she said. "Good." "Good," he agreed. They ordered. They ate. They talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with Meridian, about the towns they'd each grown up in, hers smaller than he'd expected, his larger than she'd imagined, about the specific difficulty of raising a child alone in a city, the logistical choreography of it, and the emotional weight of being both the fun parent and the only parent simultaneously. About books they'd read and hadn't told anyone they'd read. About failure, which they were both more comfortable discussing than most people, having each been intimate with it in specific and formative ways. She talked about Sophia's father, not at length, but directly, with the clarity of someone who had done the work of understanding something painful and was no longer afraid to look at it. "He left when she was 18 months old," she said. "He said he wasn't ready for the version of life I was building. I think what he meant was he wasn't ready for the version of me." She turned her wineglass slightly on the table. "I spent a year being angry about that. Then I spent another year deciding it was my fault somehow. Then I got tired of both of those and just moved forward." "How long did moving forward take?" "It's still taking," she said, "but it's different now. It doesn't feel like moving away from something. It feels like moving toward something." She looked at him. "Recently it's felt more like that." He looked back at her. "Yeah," he said. "Same." They walked back toward the building afterward, not because either of them needed to go there, but because it was in the direction of both their parked cars, and the night was mild, and neither of them was ready for the evening to end. They stood outside the main entrance in the pool of light from the lobby, the revolving door behind them, the city doing its nighttime thing around them. "This is where you were standing," Claire said, "when I called you after the blackout." "A block and a half east," he said, "with Ava." "I know. I've thought about that image a lot. You and your daughter walking away from a building that had just—" She stopped. "And you turned around." "She told me to," he said. "More or less." "She's 8. "She's Ava," he said. Claire looked at the building. He looked at it too. 42 floors of glass and steel, and all the accumulated machinery of a company trying to be better than it had been, which was not a certain process and not a finished one, but a real one. He'd put his name on a document today that said he was part of building it, his name, alongside hers, on something that was going to outlast this particular evening. "I want to do this again," she said. "Dinner?" "All of it." She turned to look at him. "The dinner, the work, The thing we're building with the foundation. The Saturday lunches with the girls arguing about creatures that live in the dark at the bottom of the ocean. She looked at him steadily. I want to do all of it. He looked at her. Claire Ashford, who had taken his badge in a marble-floored room and turned away before he'd finished his sentence, who had called him 22 minutes later because the building was dark, and she already knew the answer to the problem was the man she'd just dismissed, who had apologized in front of a board of directors and meant it, who worked late and ate lunch at her desk and had learned to knock before coming into his office, and who was standing outside her own building in the May night telling him she wanted all of it. People were not their worst moments. He'd always known that in the abstract. He was still learning it in the particular. Yeah, he said. Me too. Quote, the Hargrove merger finalized in June. It was the largest deal in Meridian's history, and the press coverage was significant. Profiles of Claire, analysis of the deal structure, the usual financial press choreography around a major acquisition. In several of the profiles, Ethan was mentioned, the former SEAL who'd turned a maintenance role into a security advisory position, who'd uncovered the corporate espionage operation that had nearly derailed the merger. One journalist called him an unlikely guardian of Meridian's future, which was the kind of phrase that looks good in print and means approximately nothing in practice, but which Ava cut out and put on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a crab, which she said was for the anglerfish energy. He did not feel like an unlikely guardian of anything. He felt like a man who had done the thing in front of him because it needed doing, and had kept doing that, and had ended up somewhere he hadn't planned. That was most of how life worked, in his experience. You rarely arrived anywhere you had aimed for directly. You arrived at the place you'd been heading without knowing it, and then you looked back at the route, and it made a kind of sense it hadn't made on the way. The foundation completed its first full year in the autumn. 46 placements across the veteran and single-parent tracks. 11 organizations in the infrastructure program, with a combined backlog reduction that Ethan calculated had prevented, by conservative estimate, 3 facility failures of the kind that the Meridian blackout had been. The numbers were not enormous. They were real. Deb, from the first cohort, had been placed in a supply chain coordinator role at a logistics company in the second month, and had been promoted once since. She sent Ethan an email in September that was 4 sentences long and direct. The promotion had happened. She wanted him to know, and the mentorship sessions in month 2 had made a specific difference that she wanted to name. She named it. He read the email twice and filed it and went back to work, but he thought about it for the rest of the day in the background way of things that matter but don't require action. Carl was still figuring it out, which was honest and not a failure. Yolanda had found her footing in an operations role and brought a competence to it that her department head had mentioned to Ethan unprompted at a cross-company meeting, with the particular surprise of someone who hadn't expected to be impressed. Ethan received this without comment. He'd expected it. He'd known what she could do. He just needed to get her in the room. That was the thing, mostly. Getting people in the right room, reducing the friction between what someone could do and the structure that was supposed to let them do it. It wasn't complicated work. It was just work that required someone to care enough to do it consistently, over time, without fanfare, because the fanfare didn't make the thing real. The consistency did. He thought about that on a Saturday morning in October, standing in the kitchen of a house, not the small apartment, a house now, with a yard and enough rooms and a water stain on no ceilings that anyone had found yet, making coffee while Ava and Sophia argued about something in the living room with the specific intensity of people who have been friends long enough to argue about things that matter to them. Sophia had been sleeping over on weekends with increasing frequency since August. It had started as an occasional thing and become a regular one without anyone formally deciding it would, which was how the best things seemed to happen. Claire came into the kitchen in the way she moved around this house, not like a guest, but not yet like someone who owned any of it. Something in between that was its own legitimate category. She reached past him for a coffee cup and he moved to make room for her and she said, "They've been arguing about that documentary for 40 minutes. "Which one?" "The one about the Mariana Trench. Sophia thinks the cinematography is better than the one about the Atlantic floor. Ava thinks the Atlantic floor documentary is more scientifically rigorous." "Ava's right," he said. "I know, don't tell Sophia." He handed her his coffee, already poured, and reached for a second cup. They stood in the kitchen in the October morning, The two girls' voices coming from the living room, the sound of a house being used by people who lived in it. He had not planned this. He was clear-eyed enough to know that the plan he'd had, the narrow, controlled plan of a man who has learned to want as little as possible because wanting creates exposure, would never have produced this. This required the accident of a wrong door and a transparent injustice, and 22 minutes on a sidewalk with his daughter's hand in his, deciding to go back. He didn't believe everything happened for a reason. He believed that things happened, and then you made choices, and the choices accumulated into something. The accumulation was not guaranteed to be good, but it could be. If you kept choosing the right things, even when they cost something, it could be. He'd chosen to go back into the building. He'd chosen to come back the next day when she called. He'd chosen to look deeper when he could have looked at the surface. He'd chosen to stay when staying was harder than leaving. Each of those choices had been separate. None of them had known about the others. But they'd stacked, quietly, without ceremony, into this kitchen, this morning, this coffee, this sound of two girls arguing about ocean documentaries in the next room. "Hey," Claire said. He looked at her. "You have a face," she said. "Ava says that." Ava's right. She was looking at him with the particular attention she'd developed over months of looking at him, not reading him, not trying to fix what she found, just seeing it. "What are you thinking about?" He thought about how to answer that. "The transformer," he said. She stared at him. "I know," he said. "Bear with me." He looked at his coffee. 9 months of repair requests. 9 months of flagging a problem that everyone could see was real and that no one acted on because it was easier not to. And then one Tuesday morning, the whole grid drops and 900 people are in the dark and there's nothing left to do but go in and fix it by hand. He looked up at her. "I think about that more than makes sense. What it costs to let something fixable get to the point of failure. What one decision, even just one maintenance sign-off, 1 week earlier, would have changed." She was quiet for a moment. "You think about it because of the foundation. I think about it because of all of it." He looked at her. "Because the same logic applies everywhere. The thing you let sit on the backlog. The person you look past because you're focused on something else. The apology you owe someone that you keep finding reasons not to make." He paused. "Everything's a transformer eventually, if you leave it long enough." She held his gaze. "And if you don't leave it, then you fix it before it takes the building down." He set his cup down. "Or better than that, you fix it before it becomes something that needs to be fixed, while it's still just a hairline fracture in a component, while it's still small enough to handle." She looked at him for a long moment in the October kitchen light. "Is that a metaphor about something specific?" "No," he said. "It's just what I believe." She nodded. "I know," she said. "I've been watching you believe it for a year." From the living room, Ava's voice. "The Atlantic Floor documentary has 3 times more peer-reviewed citations, and you know it." And Sophia, with the particular stubbornness she'd clearly inherited, "Citations aren't the same as visuals, Ava. They measure completely different things." And Ava, already working up the counter-argument, "They measure whether what you're watching is actually true, which I think should matter." Claire looked at the doorway to the living room and then back at him, and the thing that wasn't quite a smile resolved finally, all the way. Real and tired and warm and unguarded, in the way of a face that has stopped deciding what to show. He looked at her and felt the particular, unremarkable weight of a morning that was not important in any way that could be written about, that contained no crisis and no resolution, that was just 2 people and their daughters in a house in October with coffee going cold on the counter and an argument about documentary cinematography filling the rooms. He felt the weight of it, and he did not look away from it. This was the thing that people did not tell you about the life on the other side of hard things. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It arrived the same way the good repair had arrived in the sub-level mechanical room, not with a sound or a flash, but with a hum. A steady right register hum that told you the load was distributed correctly and the ground path was clean and the system was doing what it was designed to do. He picked up his coffee. Claire picked up hers. They walked into the living room together where their daughters were arguing about the ocean, and they sat down, and they listened, and the morning continued around them the way mornings do. Ordinary and irreplaceable and entirely enough.